Today on Spooky Isles, we're talking to Vincent Price expert Peter Fuller about the 1968 Michael Reeves film Witchfinder General.
Hi, welcome to the Spooky Isles. This is David Saunderson, and today we're talking to Vincent Price expert Peter Fuller. How are you, Peter?
I'm very well, Dave. Thanks.
And how are you coping with the lockdown we're currently under here in London?
It's given me a lot of time to actually do a lot of stuff which I'm actually working on. I'm working on a cookbook about Vincent Price, so this is the perfect opportunity.
It is. So there's some good things might come out of this if we've got projects to do like you do. So today we're talking about one of our favourite films, Witchfinder General. I'm wearing a Witchfinder General T-shirt. I don't know if you can see that. And
Yeah.
Peter's wearing his Witchfinder General. It actually says Conquer a Worm on there. I don't know if you can kind of see that there. That's the I think that was the American version. So it's a famous film. People know about it, but maybe they might not know that it was actually originally a book. Can you maybe give us a few details about how the film came about and tell us about the book? I've got a copy of the book here.
Oh, and I've got a copy of the book as well.
So we're like twins today. Look at that.
Yeah, basically is Tony Tenzer, who was the head honcho of Tygon, found this. It wasn't published. It was actually a draft copy. It was about to be published. And he saw a potential in it. He regarded it as a bit of like a lowbrow historical adventure, but he saw there might be something in it. The book itself is a very fictionalized account of the real life Matthew Hopkins. Now, he was a self-appointed witchfinder, and over the course of 3 years, just 3 years, he was actually the responsible for 300 people's deaths.
Oh.
Mainly what he would do, him and his cohort, John Stern, would go from village to village, mainly in Suffolk and Norfolk and places like that, and would actually be asked to investigate evidence of witchcraft. And they would use terrible forms of torture, things like pricking, dunking, and sleep deprivation. But mainly they were targeting people who were either elderly, mentally ill, or were aggrieved. There was some aggrievance, so that people wanted to get rid of them. And it was during a period which was which was the Civil War, where law and order was breaking down, and so he could actually get away with doing this. And each place that he went to, he would get 20 shillings for each of the people who would investigate, which is about £20 in today's money. Now this formed the basis of this story, and in this story, a Roundhead soldier called Ralph Marjorie discovers that his girlfriend, his lover, has basically been assaulted by Matthew Hopkins, and has become pregnant with his child. So in revenge, he goes out to track Hopkins down, and in the end, him and 3 troopers end up hanging him from a tree. Now, that was the idea of the book. But Tony Tenzer turned around and he sort of said, okay, well, I want to do something with it. Now, he had a protege at that time called Michael Reeves, who was 24. Happened to be that's the same age as Matthew Hopkins, by the way, in the real Hopkins. And he had actually done very well on The Sorcerers, which was the sci-fi
absolutely fantastic film with Boris Karloff.
With Boris Karloff. And because on the back of him doing such a good job, Tony Tenzer gave Michael Reeves carte blanche to do this particular film. So him and his Sorcerers screenwriter, Tom Baker, set about turning that book into something which they would call a revenge Western thriller.
Yes.
And that was the target. That's the main focus that they had of what they were achieving. They weren't going to achieve a historical horror, but actually a Western transplanted to the East Anglican countryside.
So how did Vincent Price become involved in it?
Well, the thing is that Tony Tenzer wanted to make the film, but in order for him to do that, he needed to have a co-partner. So he reached out to American International Pictures because he'd actually done some work with them before. They did this, some other films with them. And they have said, yes, we'll stump up. I think the production costs were estimated about $83,000 US. And American International sort of said, oh, we'll give you 38,000, but you have to have Vincent Price because they were their lead star and they wanted to use up his contract, and he would get £12,000 for that, $12,000 for that. And so that's why they ended up having to use him. Of course, Michael Reeves would have liked to have had Donald Pleasance, because he felt that his mannerisms and his approach would be a perfect fit to the petty bureaucrat that he had created as Matthew Hopkins. But Tony Tenzer actually wanted Boris Karloff, but he was way too ill.
That wouldn't have really worked, would it, for that time? Not try to play a 24-year-old anyway. So,
that's the other thing, is that Vincent was like, he was 56 at the time, so he was like 30 years older than the character of the novel, or even the character of the real life character.
How do you think Donald Pleasance would have played it?
I think have you ever seen? At the time, I think Michael Reeves had seen Cul-de-sac, which I think is one of Donald Pleasance's best roles. And I think if you see the way he does that, he's very improvised. He could be low key, he could be manic, and he would have given a completely different role, which would have been interesting to see.
Would be. But as it was, we've got Vincent Price. Now, how did he feel about being in this film? Was it something he wanted to be in? You just said it was a contract.
Yeah, definitely. It was a contract movie. At the time, 68, he was not in a good state with his employers at AIP, because he'd actually done the wonderful Poe films with Roger Corman. And once To Malaysia had finished, he was still on contract with American International Pictures, and they actually ended up giving him an extra salary, sort of like more money for each film. But he had to do films like City Under the Sea, which was very poor. Yeah. And so he just thought, oh my God, it's another horror film. So he didn't really want to do it, but he had to. And the other thing is that what was also a bit complicated for him is that he much preferred being in a studio. He's had an apartment in London. He would like to be, go to the studio, do his work, come home, and then go out to a nice meal and actually buy some art. Instead, he found himself on location for a few weeks in September '67. The whole cast and crew all stayed at the Angel Hotel in Bury St Edmunds, and he had to be out there and doing on location every day in the wilds. But worse was that he also had to actually put up with being on a horse, and he hated horses.
Had he been in many horse films before? I know he did a Western, but did he do horse films often?
No, he didn't. No, not really. I think he was in Baghdad. He was on a horse.
Okay. So, tell us a bit more about how he felt about this film, as it was made. I imagine he might have changed his view during the period of it being made.
He did indeed. Well, the first thing is, of course, it's what's most famous about this film is the on-screen fraught relationship between Michael Reeves and Vincent Price. Michael was a 24-year-old, and Vincent was this star from had a 30, 40-year career on stage and screen, and he was then being told how to move his head, and of course it became legendary that they would have this difficult relationship off screen. And famously, there's a great famous quote where one day Vincent had actually had enough, and he turned around to Michael Reeves and said, "I have made 97 films. What have you done?" And he said, "2 good ones." But the thing was that he was told Michael Reeves wanted to rein in his typical sort of eye rolling and his camp gestures that often cropped into his films, and so he ended up forcing him to give a more restrained performance. And it was only in the final cut that Vincent realized what Michael Reeves had actually done. He had actually allowed him to really bring the character of Matthew Hopkins onto the screen rather than Vincent Price on the screen. And as such is that when he returned to the US after filming, and he saw the final cut, he actually wrote him a very long letter, basically saying how he appreciated what Michael Reeves had actually given him the opportunity to do, but also to apologize for a little bit of his attitude whilst they were filming.
apart from Vincent Price in this film, one of the big sort of stars of it is the locations, really, isn't it? I mean, you've got East Anglia, which is just looking magnificent. Can you maybe tell us a bit about bringing the production in there and choosing the locations? Because I know
I think
I know you've actually been out to, I've been with you at some of these locations. So you tell us about that.
yes, one of the most important key factors as to why Witchfinder General is the classic that it is because the locations are a character themselves. Michael Reeves, who grew up in that area, really wanted to make it the forefront of the film. It was about economies of scale as well. They were on a very small budget, but they had to make it look epic. They wanted that Western epic look. And the East Anglican countryside was just beautiful. September 1967, it's a great period to shoot. And also he had to shoot within a very small time frame to capture the colours of the landscape and the countryside. It was also the area where both the real life Hopkins and Stern actually plied their trade. So we went to so some of the locations that are used are places like the medieval village of Lathenham and Kersey. There's also Rushford College, which was used in a scene where Richard and Sarah actually do their vows. There is a water mill, which is where we see Oliver Cromwell with his troops.
Yes. Yep.
In one scene, and these are all in the same area. And also is that other places are Castle Orford, which actually is the big castle sequence at the end, the torture chamber sequence at the end, and that was suitably imposing and gothic, and really provides the film with a great climax. And then there's some other places that were used. One place, which for many, because I do these guided tours to all the locations now. One place that was always one we couldn't find was where the beach scenes took place.
Yeah.
And we only found out recently that in fact it's a place called Seven Sisters on the Sussex coast.
Yeah.
Long way from
very
Suffolk.
far away. Yeah. So we're talking about the stars, Vincent Price, and the locations, but talk to us about like Ian Ogilvy and some of the other players in this film. Tell us about their involvement.
Well, Ian Ogilvy comes straight through into the production because he had actually worked with Michael Reeves on The Sorcerers previously, but it goes back further. They were actually childhood friends, and there was a long period where they hadn't seen each other. But when The Sorcerers came up, it was Michael Reeves who wanted to get Ian Ogilvy into it, and of course, so therefore he ends up doing that because he'd actually done Michael Reeves' first film, The She-Beast, with Barbara Steele.
Yes.
So Ian actually ran as in all three of his films, and I think he does bring a real the right attitude to his role, which is Richard Marshall. He's the Roundhead soldier, and he really did epitomize the youth of the day, which was like trying to rebel against society, against the established order. But of course, his character is one of those characters which, during the course of the film, you see he just ends up being out for revenge, and so in the end, he ends up being just like the patriarchal society, which is actually causing so much destruction at the time.
You've spoken to Ian Ogilvy about this. What's his feelings about this film?
He loves the film. He always gives great stories about Vincent Price. One of my favourite stories that Ian Ogilvy talks about is the day that Vincent was on the horse, and he was, and he got chucked off the horse and ended up in a ditch. And of course, Ian Ogilvy is on his horse riding by, and Vincent turns around. She turns around and says, "Oh, isn't she pretty?" So I think Ian actually thought Vincent was slightly camp and theatrical, but
Yes.
Ian enjoyed him. But of course, Vincent had some great time with the cast and crew. He got on really well with the cast and crew, to such a point that one day, when the catering hadn't arrived, he actually ended up at the hotel cooking up a big vats of pasta to take to the cast and crew.
Well, that's nice of him. So, How long was the filming go for? How long did the filming go for?
It was about 3 weeks in September of '67. It was a very quick turnaround in terms of getting it edited, because it was when and that's another story. That's the census and Michael Reeves' fight or battle with the census is another story. But in the end, it ended up being screened in May of '68, right at the time that a lot of political turmoil was happening. And that also informs in the way we see Witchfinder General today. When it was released, there was like the student riots in Paris, there was the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, and even Martin Luther King being assassinated. So it came at a time where it really did reflect what was happening. And I think a lot of film scholars today look at that and read into that today. And I think that's one of the reasons why Witchfinder General, his legacy continues on.
What you've spoken to other people that were in the film. I think you spoke to Nicky Henson, who died not long ago. What other stories can you tell us about the filming of the production? We could just kind of get into the censorship in a sec, because that's obviously quite interesting. But we'll just focus on the production at the moment. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, Nicky, surprisingly, was a good friend of Ian Ogilvy's. They studied together in drama school. And one story which Nicky Henson actually told me was that Vincent was a big fan of Native American Navajo jewelry. And at the time, so was he. He wore lots of bangles and things like that. And one day at the Angel Hotel, after drinks with the cast and crew, as Nicky was, Vincent was actually showing off his jewelry, and one of which, of course, is this watch, which was Vincent's watch that he wore throughout his life. And you could see the Navajo, the Navajo thing. Anyway, he was showing off all of his jewelry. Thing, and of course then Nicky Henson walks in, and of course he's sporting his jewelry. He goes, "You call that jewelry? What about this?" jangling jewelry.
So you kind of like to one up everyone, in
Yeah.
some way, or have a little bit of a play. So, did they all enjoy working with Vincent?
Oh yes, I think so. Yeah, there's some hilarious stories that Philip Wallilove tells, who's the production coordinator. He was a BBC. He worked for the BBC, and he actually got himself onto the production as an associate producer, because he actually put in $5,000 himself. But he was the person responsible for going out and getting all the locations and everything. But there's a great story which actually is the tail end of the story about the horse. Was the day that Vincent was jumped off the horse. He was very angry with Michael Reeves at that point. He locked himself up in his room at the hotel, and it was Philip Wallilove who'd actually come up to try and actually get him to go back on set and to look after him, and to see how damaged his spine was, and whether he needed a doctor or anything. And Vincent said, no, I don't want to see anybody. I just want to lock myself away. And he says, but what I'd like is, I would love it if somebody could just give me a massage. And so anyway, is that he said, oh, okay, well, I'll need to have this massage, but I need to lean down near the bed. And so he goes, Philip, would you, help? And so Philip is actually massaging Vincent's back when the maid walks into the room. You can imagine what they must have thought.
It's sort of the start of a Carry On film, really, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. That story gets told in, I don't know whether you've heard of the BBC 4 radio drama called Vincent Price and the Blood Beast Terror.
No, I've not.
It's a dramatization about the relationship between Vincent and Michael Reeves.
Okay.
And it's quite witty. And Nicholas Grace plays Vincent Price in it. A very camp Vincent Price, I must admit. But it is actually hilarious to listen to. And I recommend anyone seeking it out if you want to.
Where can you get it? Is it available?
You can find it on BBC 4 online. When you go BBC.
Okay, well that's something. That's something to look at. So, what did the local people think of all this going on?
Well, interestingly, is one of the key places that they shot at was in Lavenham, in the town square there, which is beautiful because that had been used in other films as well. It's used in The Canterbury Tales by Pasolini, and Barry Lyndon, and also in The 13 Chairs, which was Sharon Tate's last film before she unfortunately was killed by the Charles Manson gang. But it's a beautiful little village, and there's one key scene, which is the witch burning scene, which all takes place because in the story is Richard, the Ian Ogilvy character, has sent Sarah, who's played by Hilary Dwyer, which we'll need to talk about, by the way, she's actually in Lavenham, but unbeknownst to them is that Hopkins has arrived to actually investigate a witchcraft accusation, and this woman, Elizabeth, she ends up being burnt in the village square. Now, that scene had to require extras. And what happened was that Philip Wadilove was actually he knew that there was an American airbase nearby, and so they actually got all the people, the personnel, the families living there, and brought them out and paid them £1 a day, dressed them in sackcloths, and said, "Here we go." But talk about economies of scale is that they ended up using like a cherry picker to actually get all the nice sort of like big shots, high shots. And in order to hire the square out for the day, they nominally gave 30 quid to a local school's playing field fund. So, but the extras really enjoyed it. And in fact, I've actually met one of the extras who was like he was like about 8 at the time. Because his dad actually was one of the people working at the base, and he took lots of photos behind the scenes photos, and I've seen them and they're great. They're really good. So yeah,
that's fantastic. You were just mentioning Hilary Heath. You wanted to say something about her? Or Hilary Dwyer. I made the same mistake you just did. Yes.
Yes, Hilary Dwyer. Now, she unfortunately, it's very sad, but she died this week from coronavirus. Very, very sad. But she was in not one but 3 of Vincent's films. She's here in Witchfinder General. She plays basically the object of his affection. And she would next go on to be in The Oblong Box, where she plays his wife. And then finally, in Cry of the Banshee, she plays his daughter. And there's a famous little sort of quote that she actually said once when she was talking to Vincent one day. She said, "Okay, so I've played your girlfriend, your wife, and your daughter." And Vincent turned around and says, "If you end up playing my grandmother, I'll marry you." A nice little quote.
Did you know her very well?
No, I've never met her, but we had plans of putting together an event, and unfortunately, very sad to hear that news this week, that she's passed away. And yeah, it's a very sad loss. Hilary actually went on and married, but she left acting and she became very good in production. She was a producer and she did a lot of work in other fields. So it's sorely missed.
Thanks for telling us about that, Peter. And obviously our sympathies are with Hilary's family at this time. We'll move on. Can you tell us a little bit about the censorship issue and how that affected the ending of the film, or how it was portrayed?
Well, originally is when Michael Reeves submitted the film to the censor, John Trevelyan, he originally said he didn't find too much to worry about. However, when the music effects and the sound effects were added, it really heightened the sense of the horror. And he was horrified. And he said, "I'm not going to pass this unless I have a section of cuts." Now, I can give you, those cuts are actually quite, I could read it verbatim, actually.
Yeah, go on.
Substantially reduce the spiking of lows, Sarah's father in the back, and reduce his screams. Remove the whole episode of a woman being hit and half strangled in a cell. There should be no shot of her at all. Reduce the ducking of the parson, that's Sarah's father, John Lowes, and the 2 women who went under with him. Reduced to a minimum the burning of Elizabeth Clark, that's the Lavernon episode, including shots of her being dragged to the gibbet. In some prints, that shot was actually remained. There should only be distant shots of her flames, but yeah, I've seen that there is a close-up. Reduce the episode of Sarah being tortured with a spike and screaming, and substantially reduce the shots of Richard chopping up Matthew with an axe. So, of course, they did all of that, and the final cut is still quite gruesome for the time. So much so that some local councils actually really complained. But interestingly, Tony Tenzer turned that all around and actually got new posters coming out saying the film they tried to ban. And of course, it didn't matter because the box office was very good.
Was it ever banned anywhere?
No, it's not banned because it was. They tried to ban. So, but basically, because John Trevelyan said, "I'm not going to pass this film without the cuts." Michael Reeves, to and fro. There was a lot of to and froing, but he accepted some of the cuts, and what we see now is the final cut that we see. However, in the Blu-ray, you do have, which is this one here, you do have the some scenes. Oh, actually, no, I think it's the DVD. They have some scenes of the bits that are cut out, and you can see them with the grading. And having looked at it, I actually don't think it actually changes it at all. I think what we see is as good as we get.
Okay. Michael Reeves died very young. I think this was his last film. What is his legacy as far as this is concerned? What do you think he left behind?
I think Witchfinder General is his masterpiece. But it's sad to think what he could have done later on. Because he died prematurely. Tragically, it was an accidental barbiturate overdose, and that was in September of '68, I think, '69. Sorry, and he was actually in pre-production for The Oblong Box at the time, and again, he was undergoing sort of like he had some mental issues. He was suffering from depression and insomnia, and I think having come down after doing so much in Witchfinder General, putting so much energy into that, it must have been a big come down for him. And I can understand how he must have gone through that period at the time. But the accidental overdose was unfortunate, and we could only imagine what he could have done in the future. And also to have him today to look back at how he would see Witchfinder General in today's climate.
Yeah. How do you think, what did you think this did for Vincent Price's career? Obviously, he was a big star at the time, but as you say, he was kind of known for his kind of campy type of evil performances where he was a stone cold, mongrel in this one.
Yeah, well, he, in that letter that he sent to Michael Reeves, he said, this was one of the best performances of my career. So I think that says a lot, because when he finished filming, in fact, the final sequence that you see in the film, the last thing they shot was actually in Castle Orford, which is the torture scene. And that was a very long night shoot. And at that point, Vincent had had enough. He was due to be on a plane the next day to head over to New York to start production on his one and only musical, Darling of the Day. And he actually arrived drunk on that night shoot. And famously is that Michael Reeves said, how dare he? So what he did is he told Ian Ogilvy to really lay in with that axe, which was a rubber axe. But Philip Wadilove saw, hey, I don't want my, our leading star to actually get really damaged. So they put lots extra padding. But, Ian Ogilvy did go in there with those wax. But Vincent was on a plane the next day, and he was had left the production. But after that, '68, is that he goes through a series of more AIP films, but also some independent films. But it is the beginning of him sort of winding up his film career as such, because he was about to actually do two of his greatest films, The Abominable Dr. Phibes and Theatre of Blood. So he still had, even though he was not really happy with his contract, those two films were his legacy as well.
So, Peter, why was it called The Conqueror Worm when obviously, we call it Witchfinder General, I believe, and our T-shirts are telling us it's The Conqueror Worm. What's that all about?
Well, what happened was that AIP basically wanted to shoehorn Witchfinder General into their Poe cycle. Once Roger Corman and actually finished Tomb Lagier, Deke Hayward, who was the AIP's head of the European department of AIP, thought, okay, I want to continue the Poe cycle. So that's why they did City Under the Sea. And with Witchfinder General, they thought, okay, how do we do that? So they basically called it The Conqueror Worm after the poem by Edgar Allan Poe. And then in the States, they basically got Vincent to do a little bit of a narration of like an opening and closing. That's something I've never seen, by the way. But what I have seen is that I've got the great lobby cards, which I think are probably the best I've seen of things. So I can go through. There are 8 of them.
Okay.
Can you see them?
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. It's funny that they put the word Edgar Allan Poe when it clearly has nothing to do with Edgar Allan Poe. It's a fraud, but anyway.
Because on screen, it's called Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General.
Okay.
Whereas we just know as Witchfinder General. But I think that was one of the reasons why, because AIP wanted the full North American rights. So in doing so, they made those changes. And interestingly, is that the release that they showed was the unedited release in the States. And nobody complained about it. And in fact, it didn't do spectacular business until after the censors started complaining. And then that's when AIP sort of like relaunched it, and it got made bigger, bigger business. I think it ended up on its $83,000 budget. It made 1.5 million, but I have read reports that it made 10 million, and I have no idea where that comes from. But still, it made.
And you've got another poster, I believe. You've got.
Now this is another one. Is that we were talking about Nicky Henson and Ian Ogilvy. So I got this fantastic Belgian poster, but I've got it signed by them. So independently, of course, and it's also signed by Arnold Miller. Now, cult film fans will probably know his name because he's done a few exploitation films like with Tygon. So, but I thought I'd add that one to the mix because that's quite good.
Okay, and you've put a plug in for your book. You've recently published a book about Vincent Price. Can you tell us a bit about that and show it to us and tell people how they can get a copy of it?
Well, this is Into the Velvet Darkness, a celebration of Vincent Price. It's a We Belong Dead publication. And it is basically 65 contributors talking about their love of Vincent, his films, his TV shows, his culinary legacy, literally everything. And it's a great primer of Vincent. I've contributed a number of articles in here. Victoria Price has actually done the foreword, and David Frankham, who was in 3 of Vincent's films, did the afterward. And of course, it just came runner-up in this year's Rondo Awards. But I recommend anybody seeking it out. It's in a softback version. That's the one that's available. The hardback versions are all sold out. They went very, very quickly.
Okay. And what have you got coming up, Peter? Because I mean, you've written your Vincent Price book, and what's coming up next for you?
Well, I'm currently working with Victoria Price on our ESC tours, which is our guiding service. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, the coronavirus, we're having to re-look at how we're going to do things this year. But we are still, we'll be back in action next year. In the meantime, I'm writing a cookbook, and Victoria and I are actually starting to plan some presentations through the vincentprice.com and Vincent Price Legacy. We'll be doing some presentations together ourselves, a bit like what you and I are doing, Dave. So there'll be more information about that to hand if anybody's going to the Vincent Price Legacy UK Facebook page.
And there's a website as well, which is...
There is vincentpricelegacy.uk.
It is. It's a great website. So thanks for that, Peter. We've spoken about Witchfinder General today, and we've also spoken about a whole lot of other films. And I'd love to get you back and talk about some of Vincent Price's other work he did in Britain and just generally. So you take care of yourself, and we look forward to talking to you the next time.
And we'll see you all too. Bye.
Bye-bye.